Thank you, Madam Chairman. Is anyone on the panel not familiar with the Earth's last glacial maximum roughly 20,000 years ago? Okay, everybody is? Good. For those in the audience who are not, by way of background, during the last glacial maximum, Northern Europe was under ice. Roughly 90% of Canada and almost all the continental United States of America, north of Missouri and the Ohio rivers and east of New York City, under ice. According to the United States Geological Survey, during the last glacial maximum, again 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 410 feet lower than today. Stated differently, for 20,000 years, sea levels have risen, on average, 2 feet per century, versus the much less, roughly 1 foot per century rising rate since 1993 that is reflected in Dr. Alley's written testimony. Finally, per Zurich University of Applied Science, Earth's average temperature 20,000 years ago was 48 degrees Fahrenheit versus 59 degrees Fahrenheit today. That's an 11-degree increase in global temperature average over the last 20,000 year period. So my question to each of you is, and we'll start over here with Dr. Pfeffer and move from my right to left, did human beings cause the global warming that started 20,000 years ago and continues through today? Or if not, what did?
So the examples from 20,000 years ago that Mr. Brooks gave us they're excellent examples of the kind of natural variability that the Earth experiences. And there's no question that in the past there have been changes in temperature, in sea level rise, in weather patterns, and climate generally, as dramatic or more dramatic than what we may be experiencing in the future. And of course, they weren't human-caused 20,000 years ago, or in the last million years. All of these variable events have been occurring throughout the Earth's modern history.
Well, my first question was, in your judgment, did human beings cause the global warming that began 20,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum?
No, absolutely not. It's an example of spontaneous natural variability, one of the many ways that this whole system, whether you look at it in terms of sea level rise or temperature or storms, can be varied.
Are you familiar with the phrase snowball Earth or slush ball Earth, roughly 600 million years ago when we were almost entirely ice or slush?
Entirely natural variation.
Versus the Paleocene and Eocene thermal maximum of about 55 to 56 million years ago when the average temperature was roughly 73 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 14 degrees warmer than what we're experiencing now. If you don't mind, Dr. Walken, let's go to you. Did human beings cause the global warming that began 20,000 years ago?
No, absolutely not. That was just a product of natural variability in the climate system. Yeah.
Dr. Moon?
Humans weren't around in nearly the numbers we are today, so we certainly weren't available to be combusting fossil fuels at the rate we are today or putting emissions into the atmosphere. You can consider we've built America in the last 243 years, and we're changing things at a much more rapid rate.
So you also agree then that the global warming that has occurred over the last 20,000 years, that 11-degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature was not human-caused, at least when it began 20,000 years ago?
So I would agree that when it began 20,000 years ago and we were coming out of the last glacial, that was not caused by humans. The warming of the last 100 years most certainly was.
Out of curiosity, why do you, or how do you explain that the sea level rise average over the last 20,000 years has been 2 feet per century, yet we're down to 1 foot per century?
So much of our rise in sea levels that you're talking about came earlier in that 20,000 years. Over this last 10,000 years, we've been sitting with very stable sea levels, and those stable sea levels have allowed us to develop the coasts of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Moon. And I only have about 30 seconds left for Dr. Bell. Dr. Bell, in your judgment, 20,000 years ago, global warming, when it began, was that caused by humans?
In my judgment, the variation that we were seeing 20,000 years ago was part of the pulse of the planet. It pulses at 100,000 years, glacial, interglacial. When I started graduate school, we were expecting to go into the next glacial period, except fact that we as human beings in the last 100 years, and you can see the tick up since we invented the steam engine, you can see the temperature moving up.
All right, I'm out of time, Madam Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. I just wish I had sufficient time to actually get into what the cause of the global warming that began 20,000 years ago was, if not humans. Thank you.
Excuse me, go ahead,
I just wanted to respond a bit further to your question. The changes in the past there are two significant differences between those events and the events today. One of them is that they were triggered by natural variations, not by human agency. And let me just give you an analogy of your house. Your house might burn down, and it might burn down for entirely natural reasons, might be struck by lightning. But it could also burn down if you're careless and you drop a cigarette in a crack on the sofa. Both of those are triggers that result in your house burning down. The presence of one of them doesn't really say much about the other, except that they both lead to the same endpoint. The other thing is that while there were these very dramatic temperature changes and sea level rises in the past, which were entirely natural, we weren't there to deal with them. The problem here is with people. How do we respond to environmental change? The Earth will take care of itself. It doesn't really care what happens. It's what people do. And if this had happened, a long time ago when the population of the Earth was a few 100 million, it probably wouldn't have mattered either because we could have just gotten out of the way. But as it is today, with the numbers of people that we have and the infrastructure, we're very sensitive to changes of this kind. We don't handle change very well. For example, suppose that the conditions for growing crops that exist today in California picked up and moved to North Dakota for a couple of 100 years. There are variations like that in the fairly recent geologic past that occurred. How would we deal with that? It's an entirely different world than what we're not here to experience, but we know about 20,000 years ago. We're much more sensitive. We don't deal well with change, and to deal with it, we need to know a lot about it.
Dr. Pfeffer, thank you for your additional insight.